How to plant a thought in someone's mind, Machiavelli's dark psychology. There is an old truth that every great strategist in history understood long before modern psychology gave it a name. The most powerful ideas are never forced onto a person. They are planted quietly until the person believes the idea was their own all along. Niccolò Machiavelli built his entire philosophy of power around this principle. He knew that direct commands breed resistance, but a seed planted carefully in someone's mind grows into a conviction they will defend as if it were born from their own reasoning. Today, we are going to explore how this ancient psychological strategy works, how history's most influential figures used it to shape decisions, alliances, and entire nations, and how you can understand and apply this same subtle art of influence in your own life, ethically and with awareness of the responsibility it carries. Before we go further, if you value this kind of deep, practical wisdom drawn from history's sharpest minds, take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. We release content like this every week, breaking down Stoicism, Machiavellian strategy, Jungian psychology, and the timeless tools of influence and self-mastery. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's begin. Principle 1. The illusion of their own idea. The deepest form of influence does not sound like influence at all. It sounds like a question, a passing comment, or an observation left unfinished. Machiavelli understood that people defend ideas far more fiercely when they believe those ideas originated within themselves. A command can be rejected. A suggestion can be dismissed. But a thought that a person believes they arrived at independently becomes something they will protect, elaborate on, and eventually act upon without ever suspecting where the original seed came from. This is why the most effective communicators throughout history rarely announced their conclusions directly. Instead, they asked questions that pointed toward a particular realization, allowing the listener to walk the final steps themselves. Have you ever noticed how often this happens? What do you think would happen if? These are not neutral questions. They are carefully aimed, designed to lead the listener's mind toward a specific destination while preserving their sense of ownership over the journey. To plant a thought effectively, you must first understand what the person already believes, values, and fears, because a seed only grows in soil that can sustain it. Machiavelli's princes studied the temperament of their courts before ever proposing a new policy, because an idea introduced without understanding the audience is simply noise. The skill lies in finding the smallest possible opening, a shared value, an existing frustration, an unresolved question in their mind, and placing your idea gently into that opening rather than forcing it through the front door. When done well, the person will later describe the idea using their own words, their own reasoning, utterly convinced it was theirs from the very beginning. Principle 2. Speak to what they already fear or desire. No idea takes root in empty ground. Every mind is already occupied with existing fears, desires, insecurities, and ambitions, and the most effective way to plant a new thought is to connect it directly to something that is already alive in that person's inner world. Machiavelli observed repeatedly that rulers who understood the fears and desires of their people could move entire populations with remarkably little resistance, while rulers who ignored these undercurrents faced rebellion even when their policies were objectively reasonable. This means that before you attempt to introduce any idea into someone's thinking, you must first identify what already occupies their attention. Are they anxious about being left behind professionally? Are they hungry for recognition they feel they have been denied? Are they fearful of a specific kind of failure or embarrassment? Once you understand this landscape, you can frame your idea not as something new and foreign, but as the natural solution to a tension that is already present in their mind. Consider how this works practically. Rather than telling a hesitant colleague directly that they should pursue a promotion, you might instead ask what it would feel like if someone less qualified were chosen instead. This does not introduce a new idea from nowhere. It activates an existing fear, ambition, or insecurity, and allows the desired conclusion to emerge organically from that activation. Machiavelli's core insight here is that people are moved far more powerfully by their own internal emotional landscape than by external logical argument. The strategist who learns to read that landscape accurately, and connect their intended idea to it with precision, gains extraordinary influence without ever appearing to exert force at all. Principle 3. The power of repetition without repetition. A single mention of an idea rarely takes hold. The mind requires exposure, familiarity, and a sense that an idea has appeared from multiple independent sources before it begins to feel credible and worth acting upon. Machiavelli understood that public opinion is shaped not by a single powerful statement, but by an idea circulating quietly through many voices until it begins to feel like common knowledge rather than a single person's agenda. The key skill here is repetition without appearing repetitive. If you say the exact same thing in the exact same words multiple times, the listener notices the pattern and becomes suspicious of your motive. But if you approach the same underlying idea from several different angles, through a story, a question, a passing observation, a comparison to something unrelated, the idea reinforces itself in the listener's mind without triggering their defenses. Each new angle feels like fresh information rather than a repeated pitch. This is why influential figures throughout history often worked through multiple channels simultaneously, allowing an idea to reach a target from several directions that appeared unconnected. When a person hears a similar idea from what feels like independent sources, whether that is different conversations, different contexts, or different framings from the same source, they begin to treat the idea as an emerging truth rather than a single person's opinion. Machiavelli's princes often relied on advisors, allies, and even carefully placed rumors to create this sense of independent consensus before introducing their own official position. The lesson here is patience. A well-planted idea rarely blooms after a single conversation. It requires cultivation across time, through varied and seemingly unconnected reinforcement. Principle 4. Let them discover the contradiction themselves. One of the most powerful psychological tools available is guiding a person toward noticing a contradiction in their own current belief or behavior, without ever pointing it out directly. When you tell someone bluntly that their position is inconsistent or flawed, their instinct is to defend it more fiercely, regardless of the evidence. But when a person discovers the contradiction on their own, through a question or an observation that simply illuminates the gap, they experience it not as an attack but as a personal insight, and personal insights are far more likely to produce real change. Machiavelli understood that direct confrontation often strengthens resistance rather than dissolving it. A prince who publicly humiliated a rival for their inconsistency created an enemy determined to save face at any cost. But a prince who quietly arranged circumstances that allowed the rival to notice their own error privately often secured a far more lasting and cooperative shift in behavior. The ego survives when the discovery feels self-generated. The ego rebels when the discovery feels imposed from outside. In practice, this might look like asking someone to walk through their own reasoning aloud, slowly, on a decision you believe is flawed. As they articulate their thought process step by step, gaps and contradictions often become visible to them without you ever needing to name them. Your role becomes that of a quiet guide rather than a critic, asking clarifying questions at the exact points where the inconsistency lives, and allowing silence to do the rest of the work. This approach requires significant patience and restraint, because the temptation to simply state the contradiction outright is strong. But the version of influence that lasts is almost always the version the other person believes they arrived at themselves. Subscribe reminder. We are moving through some of the deepest psychological strategy in Machiavelli's philosophy, and if this is resonating with you, this is the perfect moment to subscribe to the channel. Every week we bring you sharp, practical breakdowns of history's greatest strategic minds, translated into tools you can actually use. Hit subscribe now, and let's continue into the next set of principles. Principle 5. Frame the idea as their escape from discomfort. People are moved more powerfully by the desire to escape discomfort than by the promise of abstract future gain. Machiavelli understood that fear and dissatisfaction are far stronger motivators than hope alone, because the human mind is wired to prioritize the removal of pain over the pursuit of pleasure. If you want an idea to take root quickly, frame it not as an exciting new possibility, but as the natural relief from a tension the person is already experiencing. This requires first identifying the specific discomfort that already exists in the person's current situation, whether that is frustration with an ongoing problem, anxiety about an unresolved decision, or dissatisfaction with a stagnant circumstance. Once this discomfort is clearly identified, your idea should be positioned as the most obvious, natural exit from that discomfort, almost as if you were simply naming something the person already half suspected themselves. Machiavelli's princes rarely proposed new policies as bold, exciting innovations. Instead, they often framed changes as necessary corrections to problems the population was already suffering under, positioning the ruler not as an innovator but as a reluctant problem solver responding to obvious need. This framing dramatically reduces resistance, because the audience is not being asked to embrace something unfamiliar. They are being offered relief from something they already dislike. When planting an idea, always ask yourself, what existing discomfort does this idea resolve, and how can I make that resolution feel inevitable and obvious rather than novel and uncertain? An idea that feels like relief spreads far faster than an idea that feels like a gamble. Principle 6. Use stories, not arguments. The human mind resists direct arguments far more than it resists stories. When you present someone with a logical argument for why they should think or act differently, their rational defenses activate immediately, searching for counterpoints and weaknesses. But when you tell a story, especially one where the listener can see themselves or their situation reflected, their guard lowers, and the lesson embedded within the story slips past their usual scrutiny. Machiavelli himself used this technique extensively throughout his writing, drawing on historical examples, parables, and narratives of past rulers to illustrate his points rather than relying purely on abstract political theory. A story about a prince who lost his kingdom through excessive trust carries far more persuasive weight than a bare statement claiming that trust is dangerous, because the story allows the listener to draw their own conclusion from the unfolding events rather than simply being told what to believe. To plant an idea through story, choose a narrative, whether historical, personal, or hypothetical, that mirrors the situation the listener is currently facing, without stating the parallel explicitly. Allow the details of the story to echo their circumstances closely enough that the connection becomes almost impossible to miss, while never directly saying, "This is about you." The listener's mind will make that connection on its own, and because they made it themselves, the resulting insight feels earned rather than imposed. This is precisely why fables, parables, and historical case studies have remained among the most powerful tools of persuasion across every culture and era. The story does the convincing so the storyteller doesn't have to argue at all. Principle 7. Establish credibility before introducing the idea. An idea is only as persuasive as the perceived credibility of its source. Machiavelli understood that the same proposal, delivered by a trusted, respected figure versus an unknown or distrusted one, would receive dramatically different receptions regardless of its actual merit. Before attempting to plant any significant idea in someone's mind, it is essential to first establish yourself as a credible, trustworthy source in areas adjacent to the idea you eventually want to introduce. This means that influence is rarely built in a single conversation. It is built through a pattern of prior interactions where you demonstrate competence, honesty, and reliability in smaller matters, so that when a larger idea is eventually introduced, it inherits the trust already established. Machiavelli's princes spent significant energy cultivating their reputation before attempting major policy shifts, because a ruler with a reputation for wisdom faced far less resistance than one whose judgment was still in question. In practical terms, this might mean being right about smaller predictions before offering a larger one, demonstrating expertise in a related area before speaking on the primary topic, or simply building a consistent track record of sound judgment over time. When the moment comes to introduce your actual idea, the listener's mind will draw on this accumulated credibility, often without consciously realizing it, and will be far more inclined to accept the new idea as reasonable. This is why rushing to plant an important idea before credibility has been established so often fails, while the same idea introduced after a foundation of trust succeeds with remarkably little resistance. Subscribe reminder. If you are finding real value in this breakdown of Machiavelli's psychological strategy, now is the time to subscribe. This channel exists to bring you exactly this kind of deep, actionable wisdom every single week, drawn from history's greatest minds. Subscribing helps this content reach more people and keeps this channel growing. Let's move into the final principles. Principle 8. Plant doubt before you plant certainty. Before a new idea can take root, the old belief occupying that space must first be loosened. Machiavelli understood that people rarely abandon a firmly held position simply because a better one is presented. The existing belief must first be destabilized before a replacement can take hold. This is why skilled persuaders often introduce subtle doubt before ever presenting their actual idea, softening the ground before planting anything new. This doubt does not need to be dramatic or confrontational. A simple question, "What made you first believe that?" or, "Has that always felt completely true to you?" can be enough to introduce a small crack in an otherwise solid belief, without the listener feeling directly challenged. This crack creates space, a moment of uncertainty where the mind becomes open to reconsidering, and it is within this space that a new idea can be introduced far more effectively than it could have been against a fully certain, defended position. Machiavelli's princes often used this technique when attempting to shift the loyalty of a rival's supporters, introducing quiet doubts about the rival's competence or intentions long before offering themselves as an alternative. The doubt did the work of loosening loyalty, and only once that loyalty had softened did the alternative appeal become persuasive. When planting an idea, resist the urge to immediately present your conclusion. First, identify the certainty currently blocking that conclusion, and gently loosen it through genuine, curious questioning. Only once that certainty has softened does your actual idea have room to take hold and grow into something the listener will defend as their own. Principle 9. Give them an exit from their old position. People resist changing their minds not only because of the new idea itself, but because changing their mind can feel like admitting they were previously wrong. Machiavelli understood that pride is one of the most powerful forces shaping human decision-making, and any strategy of influence that fails to account for pride will meet unnecessary resistance. To plant an idea successfully, you must give the person a graceful way to adopt the new belief without feeling as though they are admitting failure or foolishness. This means framing the shift not as a correction of their previous error, but as a natural evolution of their thinking based on new information or changed circumstances. Rather than implying they were wrong before, the framing should suggest that their earlier position made complete sense given what they knew at the time, and that this new perspective is simply the next logical step in their own ongoing reasoning. This preserves their dignity while still allowing the shift to occur. Machiavelli's most successful rulers understood this instinctively when negotiating with former rivals or reluctant allies, offering them face-saving narratives that allowed a change in allegiance to feel like wisdom rather than surrender. When you plant an idea in someone's mind, always consider how they will explain their new position to themselves and to others. If the only available explanation involves admitting error, resistance will be significant. If the explanation allows them to feel like their thinking has simply matured or adapted intelligently to new circumstances, the transition becomes remarkably smooth, and the idea takes root far more permanently. Principle 10. Know when to let the idea rest. The final and often overlooked principle of planting a thought is knowing when to stop pushing and allow the idea to sit undisturbed. Machiavelli understood that overexposure to any single idea, even a good one, breeds suspicion and resistance. A thought that is mentioned once and then allowed to develop quietly in someone's mind, without constant reinforcement or pressure, often takes root far more successfully than one that is repeated aggressively until the listener becomes defensive. This requires a kind of strategic patience that many people struggle with, especially when they are eager to see immediate results from their efforts to influence someone's thinking. But minds need time to process, to turn an idea over privately, to test it against their existing beliefs without feeling rushed or pressured toward a conclusion. Machiavelli's princes often planted the seeds of a major decision months before requiring the final commitment, allowing the idea time to feel familiar and comfortable rather than sudden and imposed. In practice, this means resisting the urge to follow up too quickly or too frequently after introducing an idea. Trust the process you have set in motion. Allow the person space to arrive at their own conclusion in their own time, checking in occasionally through light, low-pressure conversation rather than persistent pushing. The idea that is given room to breathe often returns to you weeks later, spoken back to you by the very person you planted it in, fully formed and completely believed as their own original thought. This is the quiet, patient culmination of everything we have discussed today, and it represents the truest mastery of this entire art. Bringing it all together. What we have explored today is not a manual for deception or exploitation. It is an honest examination of how influence actually works beneath the surface of everyday conversation, negotiation, leadership, and persuasion. Machiavelli's insight into human psychology remains relevant 5 centuries later because the fundamental architecture of the human mind has not changed. We still resist direct commands. We still defend ideas we believe are our own. We still respond more powerfully to stories than arguments, to relief from discomfort than promises of gain, and to credibility earned over time rather than claims made in a single conversation. Understanding these principles carries real responsibility. The same tools that can be used to manipulate someone toward a harmful outcome can also be used to guide someone gently toward a healthier decision, a more honest self-reflection, or a positive change they were already circling but hadn't yet found the courage to fully embrace. The tool itself is neutral. The intention behind its use is what determines whether this knowledge becomes a form of exploitation or a form of genuine, respectful influence. You use this understanding remains entirely yours. Closing. If today's exploration of Machiavelli's dark psychology gave you a new lens through which to understand influence, persuasion, and the quiet architecture of human decision-making, do not leave without subscribing to this channel. We publish content exactly like this every single week, uncovering the deepest strategic and psychological wisdom from history's sharpest minds and translating it into tools you can actually apply in your own life.